welcome. I'm Fathali Moghaddam, Director of the Interdisciplinary Program in Cognitive Science. We're going to try to stick to the announced program and stick to the time and give the speakers enough time, around 20 minutes each. And we're going to save all the questions until the end when our discussant, Dr. Riesenhuber, is going to also have time to give us commentary. Okay, the first speaker today is Kelemen from Boston University. Dr. Kelemen has done very impressive research on the developmental aspects of what we're interested in. And rather than spend a long time talking about her, I'm going to ask her to talk about herself and her research.
All right, can you hear me? So let me start by saying how delighted I am to be here. Thank you, Fathali, for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to hearing the talks today. So one of the big questions, where does religious belief come from? And traditionally, the dominant approach to answering that question has been to assume that religion is purely a cultural product, and that people develop religious beliefs in supernatural gods, in supernatural agents, in immortality, as a result of extended years of socialization. But more recently, an alternative proposal has been gaining ground, and this is the idea that the human propensity to believe in supernatural agents is not simply a product of social learning, but is a byproduct of a collection of evolved socio-cognitive tendencies, explanatory biases, that not only function to render children and adults susceptible to the religious representations of their culture, but, according to some proposals, I put one out there, might even predispose us from very early in development to self-generate ideas that look like rudimentary versions of those beliefs. For example, the idea that everything in nature is designed. So I'm going to not focus on the Rich proposal, but I'm going to talk about a couple of the development of a couple of the explanatory biases. So here's a selection of some of the intuitive conceptual biases in addition to general theory of mind abilities that have been proposed as being relevant and making us susceptible to beliefs about supernatural agents and ideas about immortality. And what you can see at the top here is two, the teleological bias and the design and creationist bias. So the teleological bias is the tendency to view objects and events as existing for purposes. That's how I'm going to define it, talk about it today. And the design or creationist bias is the tendency to view objects and events as intentionally designed. So I'm just going to, as I say, focus on two. A lot of my work is focused on those two, plotting the early development of them and looking at the developmental trajectory into adulthood. So I'm going to try and speak through some of the work on that. So Piaget was very famous for claiming that children are artificialists, that they believe that everything is made by people for a purpose. And he claimed that because he argued that children are massively egocentric and they can't represent physical mechanical causes. So there's lots of reasons to think that proposal is wrong, because we now know that children can represent reason in physical terms from infancy. However, in a sort of common refrain that we hear from cognitive developmentalists, he wasn't all wrong, and there are in fact two bodies of evidence that have been occurring that first show that children have inclinations to view natural phenomena as intentionally created by some agency, it's design creationist bias, and secondly, that children show inclinations to broadly construe all kinds of natural phenomena as occurring for a purpose. And one of the questions then has been, in studying these cognitive biases, is do they intersect? So you don't necessarily need to, when you ascribe purpose to something, you don't necessarily need to assume intentional design. I don't necessarily believe that my hands came around through intentional design. And I'm going to say to you ahead of time that there is some evidence that these biases to assume purpose and to assume intentional causation do intersect, and that from early elementary school, children have theoretical biases to view natural phenomena as though they are artifacts of intentional design rather than as outcomes of a natural process. So just quickly on the design bias, and the primary person actually to do work on this is Margaret Evans, and she found in the initial work on this that whether kids come from secular, these are American children, come from secular backgrounds or Christian fundamentalist homes in the Midwest, children seem biased to endorse intentional accounts of first origins. So if you ask them, why did the very first ever sun bear come to be on the earth? Was it made by God? Was it made by a person? Did it change from a different kind of animal? That's a kind of evolutionary account. Did it just appear? Around between 5 and 10 years of age, children will rank made by God the highest explanation, the explanation that they believe most, regardless of their home background, regardless of whether or not they come from a religious home background. It becomes particularly pronounced around 8 to 10 years of age, where children are doing it spontaneously when they're explaining things as well, not just in the context of rating scales. And then you start to see around 11 to 13 years of age that children start to diverge and start to reflect more the belief systems of their home environment, becoming either very much designed God believers or not. And that, since that work, there's been now also a body of infancy work accruing to suggest that even from sort of 9 to 12 months of age, when children see ordered arrays of things or complex arrays of things, they tend to assume that they've been created by some agent. And I'm not going to go into all of that work in detail, but they seem surprised when it's the case that they see an ordered array and it's not being created by an agent. So that's something on the design and creationist bias. We'll talk a little bit more about our work on the promiscuous teleological bias, the tendency to broadly construe objects and events as existing for a purpose. Western adults have teleological tendencies, purpose-based tendencies, to attribute purposes and functions to artifacts. They tend to assume that artifacts are functions. Tables and chairs exist for sitting on, chair legs exist for holding up chairs, and biological properties, eyes are for seeing, ears are for hearing. But in general, they don't tend to think that mountains, clouds, icebergs exist for purposes, or that tigers and lions do. So it's a very selective kind of teleological description, purpose-based description. By contrast, in early work that we did, we found that American 4- and 5-year-olds tend to endorse that entities of all types, clouds, mountains, lions, tigers, are made for something, and that's why they're here. So, for example, if you had two individuals who were discussing whether a cloud is made for raining and that's why it's here, versus somebody else saying, no, clouds do rain, but they're not made for that, that's just something that they do, and that's not why they're here. Children endorse the person who says that clouds are made for something. So of course this is an interesting finding in 4- or 5-year-olds, but it may be less interesting if it's the case that there's no evidence that it actually persists at all. So in follow-up work, using, again, a very simple method, we just presented children with different kinds of purpose-based teleological explanations versus physical causal explanations of the properties of natural phenomena. And we looked to see which one they prefer, which one they endorse. We're particularly interested in what would happen with non-living natural phenomena, because they're the kinds of things that, if you ask, why is a rock pointy, adults will not endorse and reject the idea that the reason they're pointy is so animals can scratch on them when they're itchy, or the idea that the rocks are pointy so that animals won't sit on them and smash them. Okay? That they will always tend to endorse a physical causal explanation, so there should be a very marked developmental difference if we see a teleological bias in kids. So there's lots of data on this, but I'm going to present a subsection of it. This is what you find in terms of what children endorse in the kind of why rocks pointy scenario. You can see on the end here, this is the tendency to endorse a purpose-based explanation of any kind, whether it serves the rock itself, for example, or is kind of serving others, allowing other animals to scratch on a rock. You see adults are rejecting any kind of purpose-based explanation. 9 and 10 years of age, children are on the fence, but you can see down to 3 and 4 years of age, children are showing a preference, it's not 100%, but it's a preference for purpose-based explanations. and it's a strong developmental difference there. I should also add that the 3 and 4-year-olds are actually tested on a different study. I've just put them into this graph. It was a variant that was made that worked for little kids, but slightly different stimuli. But perhaps the best way of having a sense of what you see in kids is to show you. And in this study, what we were doing was asking children about the very first origins of things and seeing what is the first kind of explanation that comes, what is the form of explanation that comes to the child's mind. And this really is a kid who we pulled in to make a film. We literally pulled one kid in, and this is what she did. Hopefully you can hear it.
Bird existed. Why do you think the first ever bird was on the earth?
So that way people could see how beautiful they are.
So that people could see how beautiful they were? Okay, all right. I'm being a big help here. Okay. You know what a river is?
Yeah.
Well, that's a picture of a river. And here's the question. Why do you think the first ever river existed? Why do you think the first ever river came to be on the earth?
So if somebody doesn't have water, then they can just go to the river and get water.
Okay, so if somebody didn't have water, they could go to the river and get water. All right. You're being such a great helper here. And do you know what a monkey is? Well, there's just an example. That's just a picture of a monkey. But here's the question. Why do you think the first ever monkey existed? Why do you think the first ever monkey came to be on the earth? Why it happened?
So that way there would be more animals.
So that way there'd be more animals? Okay. So.
Okay. And you might ask, why are we asking the why question? Why do we adopt that form of question? It's because and why question can be answered by both a teleological or a physical, mechanical, physical causal explanation. It leaves it open, it's up to the child what they choose to select. Whereas if you ask children, how did it happen? That begs for a physical, that actually biases towards a physical causal explanation, because you're not leaving it open to the child to interpret and come to the first explanation. They might want to, you've already shaped it by the question you've asked. Children generally ask why questions. They don't ask how questions themselves. So what are the possible causes for this promiscuous teleology? This broad tendency to ascribe purposes to things. Well, obviously, one of the first things to consider is the cultural and parental factors. So we've been looking at that. What about ambient cultural religiosity? So it's the case that all of the effects that I've actually shown you were first documented in American children. And as you know, America is a religious exception. It's exceptional in terms of the religiosity within the Western world, in terms of itself as a religiosity within the Western world. So maybe this is just an artifact of children being exposed to, even if they're not in a home environment where people are talking about purposes and designs, to an environment where that kind of talk is taking place. But very briefly, when we test children in Britain, where there is an awful lot less God talk, you find the same effects. We've now completed work in China, and the data there are more complicated, just because of the cultural dynamics of testing Chinese children, but we are finding the same. We're finding far higher levels of teleological explanation there than you would necessarily expect in a culture that is at least nominally secular. Okay. In terms of another possibility, parental explanation. Perhaps parents, even if they are not themselves religious, when a kid's asking them something, they give them a purpose-based explanation because it shuts them up. You know, why is it night time? So you can go to bed. Okay? But actually what you find is that we did a desirous study looking at how parents respond to kids' why questions, the ambiguous question of why, where parents have the option of giving a physical kind of explanation or a purpose-based explanation, and what parents tend to do, even in cases where it would be warranted to give a causal explanation, physical causal explanation, is they give a teleological one. So if a kid asks, as they do, why do women have breasts, parents are much more inclined to say, because they grow them, than to say, to feed babies. And so there seems actually a bias in parental explanation in the one study that we've done towards physical causal explanation. So that then leads us to consider causes that are internal to the child, and whether it's the case that children are reasoning perhaps from an artifact analogy. That may in itself be a result of more basic intentionality and agency biases, so that children are essentially generalizing from what they understand about intentionally designed human-made objects. There are reasons to take this hypothesis seriously, but a lot more work is needed. So it's the case that you actually don't see children starting to be robustly, promiscuously teleological until they seem to have an explicit understanding of artifact design, of human-made, the notion that artifacts are intentionally created for purposes, by people for purposes, and that occurs around 3, most robustly about 4 years of age, which then you also see promiscuous teleology taking off. And this is using both implicit and explicit measures. We also know that when in that study that I showed you earlier, which actually originally was done with British children, that when you look at the kids' generations of purpose-based explanations of nature, and then later on in a separate task ask them, did someone or something make the first ever mountain river monkey, or did it just happen? Children who are more inclined in the later task to say someone made it are also the children who are more inclined to say it exists for a purpose. So there's a patterning between intentional explanation and teleological explanation. And in fact, you could actually see it in some of their explanations. I don't know who they are. Maybe this is just straight artificialism, but why did the first mountain existed? Well, they needed something to, like a paperweight. Like perhaps there was lots of earthquakes, so they thought there should be something that could stop them, so they put lots and lots of weights of stone. It was beautiful. Or why did the first ever bird exist? They needed more nature in the country. You can tell this isn't a British child. Because it probably was dirty in the olden days, so they invented birds. So I can summarise here, I know I've got 5 minutes, but I want to show you some more. That from preschool children display biases through natural phenomena as created, as existing for a purpose. And in elementary school, about these 2 explanatory tendencies show explicit signs of reorganizing or organizing in some kind of design theory about nature. But, again, in terms of thinking about making it susceptible to religious representations, is this some kind of early phenomenon that then disappears? Or is this something that actually does persist into adulthood? Now, I showed you a graph showing that the teleological bias was disappearing around 9 or 10 years of age. They were looking a bit more like adults. But that pattern is consistent with 2 possibilities. One possibility is that the tendency is being replaced, the teleological explanations are being replaced by physical causal scientific explanations as children become more scientifically literate. The other possibility is that as children acquire scientific knowledge, it actually drives the teleological bias underground. So the default tendency is to still offer a teleological explanation, and that teleological bias is still there. It's just that when children have time to reflect, they're going to offer you the appropriate physical causal explanation. Now that makes a beautiful prediction, if that account is correct, which is that when we take adults and we put them under circumstances where they don't have time to reflect, we should see signs that they will default to purpose-based explanations, even if they have very strong motivations to actually engage in physical causal explanations. And that's the study that we did with physical scientists, PhDs, long-standing at MIT, Yale, and other universities, where we look to see whether when you put those individuals under speeded conditions, despite their very strong motivations and strong training that orients them towards physical causal explanations of natural phenomena, of non-living natural phenomena especially, do they default to purpose? They show signs of defaulting to purpose-based explanations under speed. Just very quickly, I'm running out of time. So we had the physical scientists. They were being presented with explanations sequentially on a laptop screen, and they just had to judge them as true or false. Half of them were assigned to a speeded condition where they had to make their judgments very quickly. The other half were in an unspeeded condition where they had all the time in the world. There were 2 types of explanation, but these test teleological explanations scientifically warrant unwarranted purpose-based explanations of natural phenomena. I'll give you some examples. The majority of the explanations, though, were actually control explanations to make sure that people weren't just scanning for content words, weren't reading properly, that they could, under speeded conditions, still make scientifically warranted judgments. Example, stimuli, the sun, so the test sentences, the sun makes light so plants can photosynthesize, the earth has an ozone layer in order to protect it from ultraviolet light. So people are having to make snap judgments on this, having read that rain falls in order to allow plants to grow, and then these control sentences, okay, which I won't go into. But we want to make sure that people are performing well on the control sentences if we're going to take any of the speeded data seriously. And in addition, we look to see whether or not there is any teleological tendency that you see across the board is underpinned by some kind of agency belief, or seems predicted by some kind of agency belief, the explicit religious belief, I believe in God, or the more informal idea that nature is a powerful being, that nature is alive. We'll call that Gaia. And what do we find very quickly? Sure enough, under speeded conditions, what you can see here is that adults scientists double in their tendencies to endorse purpose-based explanations of nature. And this is the same pattern is found in undergraduate populations, so they're showing the same speeded effect as other folks. And I am going to wrap up. The good thing is that being a scientist and having years and years of scientific explanation does do something to ameliorate the teleological bias, and they're overall lowering their teleological tendency. But if you test humanities scholars, they perform the same way as scientists. So it's not being a scientist specifically that acts as any kind of prophylactic to teleological explanation, unwanted teleological explanation. I don't really have time to talk about anything else other than show you that it replicates in China, and that we can do an even cooler version of this where we get people, atheists, to make snap judgments on whether things are purposely made by someone, and you've seen speeded effects on that as well. People default to that belief. So very quickly, teleological and creationist biases show signs of reliably developing and tacitly persisting across cultures, even highly secular ones. These, I would argue, agency-based biases provide substantial intuitive support for viewing nature as an artifact, and therefore in belief in designing supernatural agents. Religious belief is therefore probably not solely derived from cultural socialization, because we have these reliably developing spontaneous cognitive tendencies, which are themselves influenced by cultural factors, but they do render individuals receptive from early on. What we do need to do at this point is accrue further evidence that teleological and related biases really play a role in promoting religious and supernatural belief, because we only find that a little inconsistently, but that they also do so cross-culturally. And there's lots of neuroscience questions, since I have lots of questions from neuroscientists in the room, but I'm going to end there and say a big thank you for listening to me, and to the members of my team, and to the National Science Foundation and Templeton Foundation for funding me. Thank you.
Jonas Kaplan. I'm a neuroscientist, and very happy to be here. Such an interesting topic. Really enjoying this experience so far. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about belief in the brain, and I'm going to tell you about a couple of neuroimaging experiments that we did on how the brain processes religious beliefs and values that are important to us. And I'm going to kind of use these two studies to allow me to speculate about one of the brain networks that I think is important for these processes, and I'm going to sort of give you my ideas about what I think it's doing. So, belief and disbelief. The first study I'm going to tell you about is a study that I did with Sam Harris at UCLA and our colleagues there. And we wanted to know a couple things. We wanted to ask, is there something special about the way the brain processes religious beliefs compared with other kinds of beliefs? And is there something different about the way religious people believe the things that they believe compared with non-religious people? And so to do this, we got a bunch of devoted Christians. These are people who reported believing that the Bible is the literal truth. And then we got a bunch of atheists who believed just as strongly this wasn't the case. And we put them inside the fMRI scanner, and we gave them a bunch of statements to read and evaluate, and asked them for each statement, is this something you believe, or is this something that you don't believe? We had a bunch of religious statements, things that the Christians would believe, like the Bible is free from error, the biblical God really exists. All the Christians believe these things, all the atheists disbelieve these things. So on the religious statements, we have complete divergence of the content of their beliefs. And then we had a bunch of religious statements where everybody agreed with these things. So these are things everyone believed and disbelieved together. Superman is a fictional character. People often talk to one another on the telephone. That was something people believed back in 2008 when we did this study. And so we compared what's happening in the brain when people confront one of these statements that they say they believe versus one that they disbelieve. And this is the pattern of activity that we saw when we compared belief to disbelief. So notably, we saw the some structures in the midline of the brain, including the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. I don't want to talk too much yet about what I think these brain structures are doing, but I just want to point out that one of the interesting things here was that we found the exact same pattern for both groups. So both the atheists and the Christians showed this pattern of activation when compared belief and disbelief, despite the fact that the content of their beliefs was totally divergent. When we forget about belief and disbelief, and we just look at what's happening when people evaluate the religious beliefs compared with the non-religious beliefs, this is what we saw. And again, this is something that we saw in both groups. So a couple of the things I want to draw your attention to, we found the insular cortex here, which is a really interesting finding in this context. The insular cortex receives information from the viscera of the body and processes things like feelings. And this is interesting given the role of gut feelings in moral cognition. So we're learning from moral psychology that many of our moral beliefs come down to gut feelings that we tend to justify with reason rather than the other way around. That's from the work of Jonathan Haidt and others. But the network that I'm going to spend most of the time talking about today is the one that centers on this region of the brain here. The precuneus and the posterior cingulate cortex, which together I'm going to refer to as the posterior medial cortices, and some regions that are connected to it in the medial prefrontal cortex. This is so again, this was the same pattern in both groups. This is a brain network that shows up in a lot of studies of moral thinking. So this is a meta-analysis of fMRI studies where people evaluate moral dilemmas, and we see very similar pattern of activation here with the posterior midline structures, the anterior ones, and this associated region in the inferior parietal lobe. Okay, so I'm going to give you my speculations in a moment about what I think this network is doing. But just to summarize what we found in the study, the distinction between believing and disbelieving in the brain appears similar across domains. And thinking about religion compared with more mundane topics, engaged brain networks involved in feelings and emotions and moral cognition. And that was true whether you were an atheist or a religious person. Okay, so now I want to get into this question of what exactly are these cortical midline structures doing? To me, this is one of the really interesting mysteries that's present in neuroscience right now, because this network is kind of showing up in a lot of different places. I think it's a network we didn't really know too much about before we had neuroimaging. And so this has the potential to be one of the big contributions to understanding the brain that functional neuroimaging gives us. But we don't really know exactly what it does. So the first thing that I want to note about this brain network is that it has some special features anatomically speaking. So the brain, of course, is a big network of interconnected neurons. We can think of the brain as a bunch of nodes that have long-range and short-range connections, a big complex network. And neuroscientists now are starting to apply the science of network analysis to understanding the structures of the brain. So you can break up the brain, parcel it into a bunch of regions, and you can ask which regions are connected with which other regions, and you end up with a network that we can then analyze for its network properties. And one of the things that comes out of this kind of analysis is that all the regions of the brain are not the same in terms of how they're interconnected, right? Some regions are more interconnected with other regions. And there are some regions that seem to function as hubs. They have lots of connections with other brain regions. In order to get from one brain region to another, you have to go through these regions. And these hub regions tend to be in the places that I've been talking about, these same regions that are active when we have people think about moral problems and about religious beliefs. So this picture on the left is from Hagman and Sporns' group, and they showed that these posterior regions of the brain, the midline, are incredibly interconnected hubs. And you get a similar pattern if you look at functional data, brain data as well. So this network is actually known to neuroscientists from another context where it's known as the default mode network. So the default mode network consisting of the posterior midline structures, the anterior, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the inferior parietal cortex. This is a name given to it by Marcus Rakel, who first noticed that this is a network that's activated when people are just resting and seemingly doing nothing. So if you give people instructions to just kind of lie still and relax, and their mind is wandering when they do that, there's very high resting state activity in this network. And then when people engage in some kind of external goal-directed task, where you have to focus on something, activity goes down. And so this was thought of as a sort of default mode of activity that the brain just kind of goes back to when it's not really doing anything. But of course, now we know that there are a lot of active tasks that do engage this network, and they're an interesting set of tasks. So I mentioned moral cognition before, but other kinds of social cognition tend to activate this network as well. So mentalizing, theory of mind, thinking about people's beliefs and intentions, for example. There's some evidence that thinking about oneself, self-related processing, also preferentially activates this network, although that may not be true. And episodic memory, in particular, autobiographical memories. So what is it about all of these tasks? Is this brain network really specialized for this particular kind of content, or is there some kind of information processing mechanic that's going on that's common to all of these tasks? I think it's the latter, and so here's where I'm going to give you my idea about what I think is happening. And then I'll tell you about a second study we did that sort of confirms this idea. So to do this, I'm going to introduce this model of how the brain is organized that was originally proposed by Antonio Damasio in the 1980s, and he calls this the convergence-divergence zone architecture. And the idea is that the brain is organized in a hierarchy of interconnected regions. From the bottom of the hierarchy, we have the sensory cortices. And information flows up from the sensory cortices to higher and higher regions of the brain where information converges, where more complex features are extracted, where more abstract representations are formed. So we go from primary sensory cortices to unimodal association cortices, and ultimately to multimodal association cortices. Cortex is getting information from multiple senses, from vision, from hearing, from motor regions of the brain. So I don't think that's controversial at all. It's sort of intuitive about how the brain is organized. But the important thing about this, this model is that information flows in both ways. So it doesn't just flow up the hierarchy, it also flows back down the hierarchy, right? So in order to accomplish things like memory and imagery, these higher level convergence-divergence zones can reactivate the connections that originally activated them to reinstantiate representations in lower level sensory cortex. And we have some really good evidence that this takes place now. So for example, with machine learning analysis, we can have people imagine things, and we're able to decode in very early sensory cortices the contents of those imaginations in multiple sensory cortices. So the proposal here is that the posterior medial cortices and perhaps the rest of the mode network sort of serve as a very high level convergence-divergence zone, receiving inputs from wide regions of the brain, and also feeding back on those regions to reactivate them and to be able to re-invoke all of these representations. So the tasks that involve synthesis of very different kinds of information from memory, from feelings, from sensory cortices are the kinds of things that the default mode network is going to be activated in order to synthesize these things into a coherent meaning. Okay? So one of the most complicated forms of information synthesis that we do, I think, comes in the form of storytelling. Stories are a very important part of culture and how we organize our values. They become vehicles for transmitting values. And so we decided to study stories in the brain and how values are embedded in stories and how we perceive those values in stories. In particular, we were interested in a particular class of values that seem to be special and seem to invoke a different kind of cognition. We call these sacred values. Protected or sacred values are transcendental. They're bound up with our identity, and they're seen as separate from and not reducible to material things. So a good example here is when land, which is originally seen as a resource, something to farm and use, can become transformed into holy land, at which point it's a totally non-negotiable value for us. Commitment to these values is absolute. It's not susceptible to material trade-offs. There's good evidence to this that thinking around these values is based on rules and principles rather than on utilitarian reasoning. And this can lead to some interesting phenomenon where people end up preferring options that don't maximize utilitarian gain. So an example of this from my colleague at UCLA, Morteza Begani, who did a study in Iran asking people to evaluate various deals for what they would accept for giving up the nuclear energy program in Iran. And in many cases, for many people, when he added more financial incentives to the deal, proposing more money, endorsement of those deals actually reduced. So it's like the idea of taking money for this is so offensive that you're not going to do it. So we decided to study these sacred values and how they're embedded in narratives and what's happening when the brain is processing these sacred values. And to do that, we went out and we found a whole bunch of real-world stories that people had written on the internet. And the process of how we did this is really interesting. I don't have time to get into it, but if you're interested in that, come talk to me later. We found these stories, we boiled it down to 40 stories that had moral context. These are stories people are telling about their personal lives, where they're recounting something they did that they felt was morally questionable, and they're justifying it in terms of a sacred value. So it might be something like, there's a nurse and there's a strike, and she is compelled not to cross the picket line by her friends, but she just feels that the patient's lives is more important, and so she crosses the picket line so as not to let anyone be harmed by the strike. Okay, so because culture is so important in this, we don't think that cultures necessarily deal with sacred or protected values in the same way. We don't even want to assume that the brains were behaving in the same way either. We decided to look at this phenomenon across cultures. And so we scanned a bunch of American people from the Los Angeles area, but we also found a group of Chinese and a group of Iranians. These are people who had recently immigrated to the Los Angeles area but spent most of their lives in their native countries. And we translated the stories into their native languages, and people inside the scanner read these moral stories in their native language. And then we asked them a really strange, odd question at the end of each story, which was designed to get whether or not they were perceiving a sacred value in the story. So we said, imagine you had unlimited money. Could you offer any amount of money to the person in this story to do something differently than what they did? So could we pay this nurse any amount of money to not cross that picket line? And if they say no, you couldn't pay that nurse any amount of money, it means that they perceived that she was acting on a sacred value. And then we're going to look at the brain and say what's happening when people perceive these sacred values versus when they don't. We did a whole bunch of background testing to understand what the basic values of the people were and if there are cultural differences. We did have cultural differences in religiousness, so our Chinese subjects reported praying less frequently and attending places of worship less frequently. When we looked at the brain, what we found is that when people read these stories and they perceived one of these sacred values, we had increased activation in this default mode network compared to when they read similar stories that didn't invoke any of sacred values of that. And one of the interesting things is that we broke our stories into 3 pieces, so they read through the story one step at a time. And here, looking in the precuneus, we can see that activity increased as they read through the story from beginning to end, as the story started to make sense, and the meaning of the story became apparent, and they synthesized what it was about. We did find cultural differences that varied with the concern for sacred values. So our Iranian subjects who reported having a much higher concern for sacred values showed increased differences between the sacred and the non-sacred stories, and our Chinese subjects showed the least. We also find individual differences. People who reported attending places of worship more often had increased activity in the precuneus when reading the sacred value story. So the idea here is that these brain regions serve as network hubs that help us to integrate information and are involved not just in mind wandering and thinking about things that are seemingly inconsequential, but really in thinking about what's most important to us and in synthesizing information that's of high value to us. And there's lots of other evidence, I'll say just briefly, that this network is involved in creating coherent meaning. This is a great study that I love from Jarrett and Hassan's group at Princeton. And the maps you're seeing here are maps of neural synchrony. So a bunch of people are listening to a story, and we're mapping here which regions of the brain are correlated across individuals. And he scrambled the story at different levels of temporal resolution. So in the top pane, people here are listening to the story in reverse. It doesn't mean anything. And then the story is scrambled at the level of the words, so each word makes sense. But it doesn't sort of create a longer, coherent meaning. You can scramble by sentence at the paragraph level, at the story level. Now what you see here, if you're looking for the default one effort, this is precunious right here, is that when story doesn't make any sense, we don't see these structures synchronizing across people. But as soon as we get to the sentence level, the paragraph level, and the story level, now we see this default mode network moving in synchrony across people. There's also evidence that it's activated just in pairs of sentences when the sentences make sense together and when they don't. So that's my sort of speculations about why the default mode network is so commonly seen in studies of moral cognition and in our studies of values and religion. I'll just say briefly that we also find this when people think about political beliefs, provided those political beliefs are very strong. So that's my conception of the default mode network. I think is really worth thinking about when we think about religion in the brain. So thanks a lot. I just want to acknowledge my collaborators at USC and elsewhere and from Long-Range School. Thank you.
I am Jordan. I'll talk next. That's my introduction. We're switching computers. So actually, while you're doing that, I'll just have a minute. So my research program recently, part of my research program is on social cognition, and in particular, a range of human belief systems. So I'm talking about religious belief today, but I'm talking about religious belief, which is part of a larger approach we're taking, particularly interested in the human prefrontal cortex as well. And so they map nicely onto one another. And so we're about ready here. Perfect. Thank you. So there are really three reasons that I wanted to study religious belief. One, because I think it would teach us something about brain evolution. And since I'm interested in the prefrontal cortex, and it's one of the more recently evolved areas of the human brain, it's a nice topic to study. Another reason I'm interested is that, as I mentioned, I'm interested in social beliefs in both in individual brains and across societies. And because I also see patients, and we know that brain damage in specific brain regions may affect these kinds of belief systems, that would be useful to know, because in many ways it could leave the greatest impact on families and patients, and therefore we ought to know a little bit more about it. So we also know, even from the earlier talks we've just heard, that religious belief emerged in conjunction with moral beliefs and probably went some way towards motivating political and legal beliefs. And in particular, religious beliefs have historically been thought to have a special status in the human brain, given religious texts that indicate that God or supernatural beings communicate directly with humans and not other species. As a matter of fact, if you look at the eagle down here, I think it has a cross in one talon as well. So this is certainly contemporary thinking, not just historical thinking. Thanks to the previous speaker, thank you. We already heard about some of the brain regions that we think, that we know are important for religious belief. A lot of them are in the frontal lobe or the anterior temporal lobe. Since emotion can be part of religious belief, strong emotions, we know that subcortical structures like the amygdala, and we heard the insula just before, are important. And also there's some reward for engaging in these beliefs, and we know that the reward system is probably going to be somewhat involved. in general, this area that's in orange, you could argue is not specific to religious beliefs, but might be activated depending on the experimental design you do. And using a lot of reverse inference based on a lot of studies, both functional and structural, and patient studies, you can make you can sort of make an idea about what these various regions do, from being involved in motives to processing physical and surface features, to processing social features outside of context, and to looking at contextual reasoning, particularly for complex, long-duration, multi-stage events. And here's just a specific example of compassion and what each of these areas might be doing in the case of predicting the future of an orphan. So the studies I'm going to describe today, I mentioned already, are part of a larger set of studies we do. It includes both patient lesion mapping, structural imaging, and functional imaging. So we always try to get convergent evidence when we do our studies because we think it's important. We used normative data, that is, these are normed items, just like the previous speaker. Our items from the first 3 studies tend to come from the Baylor Institute studies of religious belief. These are surveys. We took items from that survey. And participants basically had to say, like with the previous speaker, whether they agree or don't agree with the statements they're reading. We chose this because it's hard to study supernatural phenomena. And so what you can do, however, is study how people process such phenomena and the brain mechanisms that are involved. We also know that religious belief can be fractionated, and therefore you can study the particular components or dimensions in relationship to brain activity. And we wanted to know if there's something special about religious belief. So here's a set of dimensions that we found using multidimensional scaling of these Baylor items. And we basically found 3 main dimensions. One that could be interpreted as God's level of involvement. The second would be God's emotion. And the third involves religious knowledge, whether it's experiential or didactic or doctrinaire. In this particular fMRI experiment, we used healthy volunteers who mostly agreed or disagreed with statements. And we wanted to know what happened in the particular item I'm going to show you when beliefs are associated with an authoritarian figure. The yellow areas are the areas that were activated in our task with our subjects, and you can see a description of these brain areas. And the main thing to know here is that these brain areas are typically activated in all kinds of theory of mind tasks. So in this case, you're having to infer the beliefs of another. And you don't often have all the knowledge to make those inferences. So you're having to guess a little bit about it. So in this sense, if you use these activations as a guide, God's just another God. You know, you're just trying to make the same kind, you're using the same inferential mechanisms with God as you would with a good friend, a spouse, a political figure. We were curious because we had people, and by the way, that activation pattern didn't matter whether you had a belief in God or not. We had both kinds of participants in our study. In this case, we compared when they read a statement that was in disagreement with their belief, and we compared religious to non-religious folks. And if they, in particular, in the case of people who had religious beliefs, we found activations mainly in 2 areas, the insula, that we just heard about, and the cingulate gyrus, suggesting that these 2 areas, like they would be in other kinds of tasks, it's not unique to religious belief, would show up if there was conflict and disagreement, and potentially if there was a deeply held belief, political, legal, moral, or religious, you might even be disgusted by what you were reading. It would be that challenging. Well, that's a functional imaging study. And another question that might be raised is, are there actual differences in brain morphology based on some of these dimensions? And so we did a study with the same subjects. And I might mention mention that Demetrius led most of these first 3 studies along with my other fellows and students. And here's an example. If you reported experiencing an intimate relationship with God, that was positively correlated with, in this case, volume in the right middle temporal gyrus extending all the way to the pole. Not surprising, because you can find that area showing increased volume with other emotional sorts of processes. Again, nothing particularly unique here, not a special spot, a spot that you would anticipate having slightly larger volume due to, in essence, having expertise or becoming interested in this kind of knowledge set. Yeah, we heard before a little bit about the precuneus. Well, here's the precuneus volume, along with polar and orbital volumes in the orbitofrontal cortex in VA11, being negatively correlated with experiencing fear of God's anger. So less fear of God's anger, larger volume, more fear of God's anger, smaller volume. And these areas are also involved in empathy and experiencing the pain of others as well. So, in some sense, so far, these areas are not special. They are shown to be activated under other belief circumstances and other experimental conditions. And the idea that you relate to God parallels how you behave to thy neighbor seems to be supported by these findings so far. So far, I've talked about specific regions in the functional activation and in the anatomical activation, but not the network. And sometimes networks have emergent properties that you don't see in a local region, and therefore you might find some differences in the network between groups that you wouldn't see if you just focused on a single region. So, of course, we looked at this, and I just want to point out 2 pieces. If you look at the top and the bottom, religious subjects compared to non-religious subjects activated a pathway from infralateral prefrontal cortex to another region in the prefrontal cortex when monitored the intent and involvement of a supernatural agent or agents. However, non-religious subjects did not show that same pathway activation. They tended to activate more posterior pathways. And one argument would be, if you are highly simple, makes a lot of sense, if you're highly religious and you deliberate about religion often, you're much more likely to have frontal lobe involvement. If you are less religious and you cannot resort to that knowledge, that stored knowledge, you're much more likely to engage in heuristic and surface feature thinking and therefore activating other pathways. It's just sensible. Take a good look at this picture. This is from a few weeks ago. It's not an artwork, it's a photograph. And these are some quotations from Exodus in the Old Testament. Right, the hand of God. Well, it turns out that an amateur photographer off the coast of Portugal, an island, photographed that. Those were clouds. And it was a very unique pattern of light on the clouds. And there's an explanation here that I put up from a British meteorologist that explains how this could happen and how you could perceive it. Now, this meteorologist has the benefit of, we could argue, 300 years of pretty good knowledge about meteorological findings. So had the knowledge set to interpret that from a scientific basis. You could argue, just on that description alone, that phenomenal experiences are compromised between deliberative thinking, scientific thinking in this case, and perceptual impressions. So if you were naive and you saw that, it actually looked like the picture of a huge hand coming out of the sky. So we decided to explore this, in this time, with patients. And the images you're going to see are lesions, not functional images. And these are Vietnam veterans. They're all males. They're all males. They were studied in their 50s and 60s. And we gave them a questionnaire. Here's an example of the questionnaire. It's a mysticism scale. You have to answer in both directions, so we hopefully avoid biases in responding with patients. These patients had lesions throughout their brain. They're penetrating traumatic brain injury, shell fragments. They're not closed, blunt head injury. So it's a very special kind of brain injury that you mostly either see in combat or you see in inner cities, or suicide attempts. So they're rarely, but suicide attempts are usually bullets, they do kill. Inner cities are bullets. Fragments come from combat and shells exploding. So those are our veterans. And these are lesion maps. If you look at the top, you're seeing where lesions increase scores on the mysticism scale. And if you look at the bottom, you're seeing where lesions tend to decrease scores on the mysticism scale. Here's dorsolateral prefrontal cortex lesions, temporal cortex, and healthy controls. And these are scores on the mysticism scale. So if you have lesions to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, you're more likely to have a higher score on the fundamentalism scale. We presume this would not have been the case had we studied these guys before their lesions. Their injury was when they were in their 20s and they were in the military, but we don't have any data on that. We do have pre-injury intelligence data, and they're matched on that. So you can't attribute this to just differences in education or intelligence or cognitive reserve. It also turns out that if you scored higher on a concept formation task, you were likely to score lower on the fundamentalism task, and vice versa. Lower concept formation ability, higher scores on the fundamentalism scale. And that just summarizes what I just said. Now, we heard from our first speaker a little bit about whether religion is, in some sense, predetermined or educated, or you make inferences based on your cognitive competencies at a certain age. Part of that mix, that recipe, involves genetic predisposition. And so we're looking at genetic predisposition here in conjunction with brain lesions. How are you doing? Okay, so far? Good. Great. I'm cutting to the chase here, so we're getting close. Okay, so this is a study that's under review. It's not been published. And our numbers for brain lesion patients are in the hundreds, but that's still pretty small for genetic studies. So keep the genetic results, take it with a grain of salt. I mean, truly, we think there's something there, but I wouldn't bet the bank on it. So we decided here to look at an oxytocin receptor gene and locus of brain injury. And we had a fundamentalism scale that we used, the traditional one that's used in the religious studies literature. These are lesion overlay maps. And in this case, you had a high fundamentalism score if you had medial frontal lesions rather than dorsolateral, and low fundamentalism scores if your lesions were in the back of the brain. Now let me say, in the case of functional imaging, thank you, the pattern of activation, you can't always be entirely sure that those areas are essential or really important for the task at hand. But when you have a lesion in an area, it gives you a little bit more confidence that if somebody performs in a certain way. So again, as I mentioned, we're providing converging evidence here. Now, that's the lesion data. These are the two different alleles or polymorphisms of the oxytocin receptor gene we looked at. If you have prefrontal cortex lesions, it doesn't matter, as we just showed. The higher the likelihood of, the gene has less of an effect. The lesion has the most effect in producing differences in fundamentalist beliefs. But if you have intact prefrontal cortex, then we see a difference between having a higher fundamentalism score or a lower fundamentalism score based on the particular polymorphism. So that tells us a little bit also about the importance of the gene in a particular brain region, that it interacts with the region where you think the representations are to produce the effect you're interested in. So it's also an interesting way to study where genes are important, but they're not necessarily as important throughout the brain. And to look at this in a little bit more detail, we now have a high degree of volume loss in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and a low degree, and you can see that that modulates the effect as well. So it shows that the lesion is really having an important effect in relationship to the oxytocin effect in these patients. Okay. So let's go through some general conclusions from this set of studies. There's no dedicated religious or God region in the brain that we can find. We can't find it anyway. There's no evidence of dedicated brain systems uniquely devoted to religion. That is, religion and religious belief co-ops brain regions that are used for similar purposes, but for other kinds of belief systems. But that still left me in, at least with more questions and conclusions, I think. So, for example, we know that you change the design slightly, you can get different results. So there's going to be sort of a general knowledge or semantic base of religious belief that pulls different brain regions, but you manipulate what somebody has to do, whether they're, for example, are they the agent versus just deliberating about religious belief, you're going to find different aspects of activation. But we can't find that single spot. Does it involve an authority, specific supernatural authority or not? Is the religious processing explicit or implicit? So there are different ways to pry and probe this. That's going to be important. It has, as I mentioned, translational implications for us because patients change. And if you're a family member and somebody goes from believing in God to not, or from not believing in God to having a deep belief in God, that can challenge the integration of the family and can provide more problems than if somebody has poor coordination in a limb or in moving their fingers. So these are critical areas to investigate for that purpose. Since studying belief systems in general, I've become I've become very skeptical. And it turns out, at least under the conditions that we study people, and we're studying fairly educated people. I'm not sure if I'm studying an elitist group of people that have deep knowledge versus the general population that has minimal knowledge and buys into heuristics, like listening to a political candidate without understanding whether there's any validation behind their claims or not. So that will make a difference, I think, in how you study this. Are there common cognitive representations across religions? Well, I think we saw some evidence that there is, with some distinctions between religions, of course, emerging. Religious conversion would be very interesting to study, I think, and at least within the cognitive neuroscience area, has not been studied so much, if at all, really. Emotions are important for certain sets of belief, and you have to be careful about interpreting what you're doing in the context of these emotions because at least intuitively it confers some special status. And of course, this is a highly sensitive area to study. You have to study this without damaging your relationship with the rest of the society you belong to. Do not challenge them. So, especially when you have to walk outside your own discipline. We've put together a little book, Fran Kruger and I, one of my ex-fellows, that covers the range of beliefs. And then I want to talk about one, I'll be done in a sec, because I got to talk about this belief system. So this is me in Chicago when I was a kid. I'm wearing a Cubs hat. I don't know how many of you are baseball fans, so just give me 30 seconds to tell you about this. So this is one of the worst years the Cubs ever had in my lifetime. I have a smile on my face, so it shows the importance of counterfactual reasoning when you have a deep belief. And this is also a picture of me on an ESPN program many years later. They chose somebody from each decade who was a Cubs fan, and I had written a chapter on the social beliefs of Cub fans. And so they got me on that. And so they did actually get the World Series this year. So my beliefs are persistent, and in some sense, it's almost as if you expect a supernatural agent to reappear, that you're waiting for God to reappear? Well, I'm waiting for the Cubs to get into the World Series. It defies rational explanation, this persistent belief. So, thank you.
Maybe I should leave this image up since, although I might move the laptop a bit out of the way. I will be focusing on beliefs as well without a PowerPoint. Let me introduce myself. I'm Francisca Cho. I'm here in the theology department, and my focus is on Buddhist thought and culture. I think the presentation so far, we've heard accounts of why it is or how it is that the brain produces religious beliefs with Dr. Kelemen. And then the last two I would describe as, and I hope this is accurate, looking at neural correlates of religious beliefs and belief systems generally. So what I would like to do is follow up and address the question of how do religious beliefs affect the brain? All right, so we're going from a different starting point, really the inverse direction from, say, the first presentation about why is it that the brain produces religious beliefs. I'm interested, and I will speak from the Buddhist tradition to the question of what religious beliefs do to the brain. And I believe this has interesting resonances to some of the questions that have been raised here, especially Dr. Kelemen's noticing of the fact that even secular people have religious type beliefs, which leads me to ask the question, well then, is there a difference between religious beliefs and religious type beliefs with promiscuous teleology and so forth? And finally, with Dr. Grafman's presentation regarding the difference, if any, between religious beliefs and other types of beliefs. So I believe this is where I can make at least interesting observations. And finally, I would note that this focus on belief in the cognitive scientific and neuroscientific research, I think it's important to keep in mind that different cultures have different assumptions about what beliefs do, right? And so I want to bring a Buddhist perspective to that as well. What the function of beliefs are. I might illustrate this most clearly by referring to two terms in the title of today's symposium, which no one has really referred to. The title of the symposium refers to both religion and spirituality. And so it was an interesting question to me, why? Why have both titles, and what do they connote? I think generally, in our contemporary society, a distinction is made between religion and spirituality, i.e. the sort of adage about spiritual but not religious, which I think, you know, we hear as a claim that people often make about themselves. And that seems to entail the idea that being religious means that you do adhere to a set of beliefs, a dogma, a doctrine, which is thought to be mandatory to be a member of a sectarian religious group, whether that's Christian, Islam, Buddhist, what have you, that you have to adhere to a mandatory set of beliefs, whereas being spiritual doesn't entail that. Spiritual people say that they don't care about dogmas, about credos. They're more interested in living as a moral person with a certain degree of spiritual experience, cultivation, whether through meditation, rituals, or whatnot. And it's interesting that Buddhism is often invoked as a spiritual tradition and not necessarily a religious one. In many years of teaching Introduction to Buddhism and other courses in Buddhism, of course, this is the comment that I get over and over again, some version of it. Buddhism really is a philosophy. It's not a religion. Religion is non-dogmatic. It doesn't care about beliefs, or it doesn't require to hold to a credo. So it's interesting in that I want to suggest that this question of whether Buddhism is a religion or a spiritual path really speaks to, or can be indexed to, this question of what Buddhists think beliefs do, why it is that one ought to have beliefs. Because in fact, Buddhism makes a lot of propositions and requires, in a sense, or encourages people to reflect on certain propositions. And some of the more famous ones is that all existence is suffering. That is the first noble truth of the Buddha. That there is no such thing as a soul, understood as, a enduring, eternal, unchanging part of the self. And then perhaps most famously, a belief, seemingly a required belief to be Buddhist, is that you believe in karma, the process of death and rebirth driven by the moral law of action and reaction, moral actions leading to correlative consequences at a future time, whether that's later in your life, 5 minutes from now, 10 years from now, or in a future life. And so this appears to be a sort of mandated religious belief. So it seems like Buddhists do have religious beliefs, contra the claims of some of my students, at least before they take my class. But I think there is something to the claim that Buddhism is not religious, it's more spiritual, because there is something culturally unique about the Buddhist attitude towards such beliefs as the assertion of suffering, that all life is suffering, and that our actions lead to consequences that drive us into future lives. And to sort of lay it on the table before I go through my demonstration and argument, the Buddhist attitude toward beliefs and what it does to the brain, and of course Buddhists don't talk about the brain, they're not neuroscientists, and I'm going to be invoking traditional Buddhist texts and discussions, that go back before the Common Era. But you can translate the Buddhist attitude towards beliefs as something like this. Beliefs are a kind of sports training for the mind. Beliefs are a way of conditioning the mind so that it leads to beneficial actions. And these actions are invariably described as acts of the body, speech, and thought. All right, so no brain science here, no neuroanatomy, physiology, and the kinds of pictures that we've been saying, but this would be the closest translation, that the purpose of a belief is to affect behavior, which is defined in this threefold manner of what you do, what you say, and what you think, right? And what's interesting about this notion of the purpose of beliefs is that the concern with the truthfulness of beliefs, truthfulness defined as correspondence of statement to some metaphysical state of affairs, is of very little concern here. So here's an interesting cultural difference that I think we need to be aware of, especially in these cognitive scientific studies. When you talk about religious beliefs, I think we have the assumption that religious beliefs are always about metaphysical claims, about some state of affairs. I believe X to be the case. But that's not always the situation when, for example, Buddhists make belief statements. And so I want to refer to a couple of traditional Buddhist texts to illustrate or try to demonstrate the idea that the purpose of beliefs is to affect one's actions in the world with very little concern about the truthfulness about the belief statement. In one early text, there is a discourse about the 5 beliefs on which one should reflect. Themes, they're actually called, but synonymous with beliefs. The first belief is that one is always, all beings will inevitably succumb to old age. All beings will inevitably succumb to illness, that they will inevitably succumb to death, that they will inevitably lose everything that is dear to them, and ultimately, the 5th belief that one will inherit one's karma, so that if you perform good actions, you will get good fruits in a future life, and similarly with evil actions. So these are the 5 beliefs, and it is stated in each case that the benefit of reflecting on those beliefs and holding on to them is that one will avoid misdeeds of body, speech, and mind. Now, you might say that old age, illness, and death hardly qualify as a metaphysical religious belief system. It's not akin to positing the existence of some supernatural agent or divine agencies. And I think this is what we normally assume a religious belief to entail. You might argue the case that, okay, this doesn't require any extraordinarily different brain mechanism or social action to believe in the truth of old age, illness, and death. But then on the other hand, it is curious that these particular events would be singled out for emphasis, right? Why meditate on the fact of old age, illness, and death? Maybe to some people it's not all that remarkable. There is a specific benefit in meditating on these facts. It neutralizes what the text calls intoxication with youth, intoxication with health, intoxication with life, and that leads to this beneficial result of not committing misdeeds of body, speech, and mind. But when it comes to the belief in karma, this is where the assertion does seem to get metaphysical, and again, the response is you believe in the possibility of future lives, not because the concern here is that it's true, that someone wants to believe that that is in fact true, but rather believing that your actions have consequences leads to the avoidance of misdeeds. Right? So another example in a different text, and I'm drawing all these texts from the Theravada tradition, the Pali Canon, the earliest school of Buddhism. In another text, it's explicitly considered whether rebirth and successions of lives actually exist or not. And in the text it's stated, belief in karma is a lucky throw, it's a good wager. And it's fascinating that it has a kind of parallel to Pascal's wager for the existence of God, which philosophers have considered to be an improvement as far as religious arguments for religious belief are concerned, because it draws on probability theory, I believe, rather than something like Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. So in brief, Pascal stated that to wager that God does not exist and to be wrong would to
to wager that God does not exist and to be wrong would have very bad consequences. You can lose salvation, right, and eternal life. So it's much safer to wager that God does exist, because even if you're wrong then, there's no consequences. But there are severe consequences to wager against the existence of God and be wrong. In the case of the Buddhist text, it states, very interestingly, to wager against the existence of future lives and be wrong is actually still a good benefit, because to believe that your actions have consequences will lead you to behave properly and become happier in this life. And even if there is no future life, it doesn't matter, all right? So the idea is it's much better to believe because of the benefits you'll gain in this life, as opposed to whether or not the belief is correct. And finally, in a recent article that I wrote entitled Buddhism, Science, and the Truth About Karma, I took this question about the metaphysical truth or untruth of karma doctrine and looked at studies of Buddhist communities today, particularly Tibetan refugees in India, to see how the belief in karma functioned in their society and in individual lives. And it's interesting that the doctrine of karma has been taken as a philosophical assertion on the part of Western philosophers and even scholars of Buddhism. Generally, the idea is that the doctrine of karma is a Buddhist form of theodicy that explains why bad things appear to happen to good people and why bad people appear to get away with their misdeeds. And the explanation is, oh no, there actually is justice in the world, because future lives will lead to just deserts for each individual. What the studies of actual Buddhists seem to suggest, however, is for them it's not a metaphysical proposition or debate about whether or not cosmic justice ultimately prevails. What medical anthropologists studying these refugee communities have determined is that when bad things do happen to Buddhists, they tend to use karma as a way of coming to terms with what has happened to them. Okay, so if you think in terms of therapy and psychology, it allows the Buddhists to set aside this sort of why me question. Why did this bad thing happen to me? And instead move forward, especially given the belief that if you've had a lot of bad things happen to you recently, you've expiated a good measure of your bad karma, and you can look forward to moving into the future in a much better direction. So you might say here, studies on the ground also seem to suggest that the purpose of the belief system is what benefits it accrues to you in terms of what you think, what you say, and what you do on the ground, as to whether or not you are making an assertion of metaphysical belief and truthfulness. So, to reiterate, what I think is a benefit of this kind of cross-cultural examination of religious beliefs is to give us a bit more sophistication in understanding cross-culturally on the ground what religious beliefs do, how they function, and whether or not what is at stake in the practice of religion has to do with making speculative statements of beliefs about the nature of the world, or whether it has to do with more immediate concerns about how to move into the future. And hopefully, in some ways, that perhaps messes up the question about what's the difference between religious and non-religious beliefs, as Buddhism tends to do, because sometimes it's more beneficially classified, some people think, as a form of psychology than religion per se. But historically, I don't think there's any dispute that we must think about Buddhism as a religion and see what its own practices and ideas have to contribute with our scientific attempts to understand the nature of religious actions. Thank you.
Great. Good. Yeah, this is gonna come up later. Okay, great. So, yeah, hi, I'm Riesenhuber here at the Department of Neuroscience, and Holly asked me to give a critical commentary. So, yeah, we'll see what happens. Good. So, what I'm doing is I'm also doing brain imaging and a lot of those good things. We're just working on more mundane topics, so I'm not going to talk about those, obviously. So let me summarize the symposium real quick, because I think it's really interesting. And fortunately, I'm still with the microphone. So, so I'm going to have to look at you guys, which is wonderful. But, so we did two talks, the two J's, right, Jonas and Jordan, showing us how belief and religiosity engage known brain regions and help us understand how they, well, they help advance our understanding of cognitive neuroscience, belief networks, how does the brain deal with belief, and social networks and all that. And then depth, a lot of food for thought, how the mind seems to be predisposed to religious beliefs and supernatural agency. And then I think Fran made that good point, religion is more than rules and creeds, right? So it's not just, okay, I have these rules and I'm going to follow them and voila, I'm religious, right? But rather that there's a spiritual side to it that poses unique challenges for studying religion scientifically, and I'll get back to that. So it's very exciting to see how religious beliefs engage known brain networks. I kind of touched on this like conscious research, as I will, where people look at the neural of consciousness, right? So we can talk about the neural of religion, right? The NCR, as it were. And it makes sense that faith has to interact with the natural world, right? We have certain beliefs, but as Fran pointed out, they have to affect our actions, right? And so there has to be this interface there between beliefs and then the physical brain, the physical world, and so it's very interesting to see where that might happen. And then it makes sense if you're more legalistic, right? It might involve then more cognitive control and so on and so forth. And for beliefs, right, you can have different kinds of beliefs, like religious, non-religious. Again, they can involve brain networks involved in belief. But the point I want to make is that that with the neural correlates of religion, they're not identical to religious experience, right? So with the neural correlates of religious experience, it's not religious to it's not the religious experience itself. So it's not splitting hairs, right? But it's kind of the essence of it, right? That we're looking at neural correlates, but then what's so funny about religion is, right, that it's much more than that. And to make that point a little more clearly, because I think it's going to be instructive, is to come back to consciousness research, where people are looking at, well, how's consciousness linked to the brain? And so people are looking at the neural correlate of consciousness, the NCC, and right? So here's one study, and sorry, the microphone is kind of funny now. So here's one study from Stanley Hahn's lab that's showing how I can classify the conscious states of different individuals by looking at the EEG. Right? So here we're making a statement about consciousness based on neural measurements. And another very popular way to study consciousness is then, for instance, bicycle percepts, right? Finding neurons that correlate with the conscious percept even if the physical stimulus is the same. So one popular object here is the Necker cube, and so here that was the little demo. So here you see this moving around, right? I'm sorry, bottom is cut off, so let's see if I can get that up. Right, so here, and what you see is, I mean, the thing just rotates, but if you focus on one corner, you see it just kind of moves around, but yet, you might have this sensation that all of a sudden kind of flips, right? That, so it rotates one way, one corner's in the back, all of a sudden it comes to the front. Do people see that? Yeah. So, yep, okay, I see nodding. Yeah. So here, physically, it's the same, that somehow some things flip in your brain, right? And so your conscious state then gets modulated. And another paradigm that's been used is binocular rivalry, where you present different things to the two eyes, and then your percept again can flip between the two eyes somewhat unpredictably. And people have studied that. So one of the early studies was by David Leopold and Jonas recording monkeys. So in monkeys you can do neural recordings, so we see a lot of fMRI, but this is actually a nice paradigm to study in monkeys. A little bit harder to study religion in monkeys, obviously, but consciousness is more amenable. So, but here the idea is that the monkey's presented with these two stimuli, the two eyes, and the monkey's trained to report the percept. And so either left eye, right eye, it's a very, very sophisticated way of training the monkey to make sure the monkey's not cheating. And so, because monkeys like to cheat, right? But so the monkey's trained to report, okay, what am I seeing? And so what we see here is that the monkey report in red and green. So time goes this way, and then response of a neuron, there's not a neuron here in temporal cortex, response going up. And so what we see here now is that the physical stimulus is always the same, and yet what we see here, the monkey's report changes, right? As you would expect, sometimes you see right, sometimes you see left. But now the important thing is here, so the monkey reports changing percepts. But then you see also that the response of the neuron changes according to the percept, right? So here, the neuron is firing, the monkey says right. Then here, the neuron is more silent, the monkey reports left, the monkey reports right, the neuron fires again, so on and so forth, right? So here, we see so the physical stimulus is the same, yet somehow the monkey brain has a different percept, and that's reflected in what these neurons are doing. So now one can ask, well, does it explain consciousness? And so this gets down to, in consciousness, there's easy problems, at least according to some people, and so this is a slide I stole from someone else, and he's a very humorous person, but so there are easy problems, but then there's the hard problem, right? The qualia problem, in that, well, why does consciousness feel the way it does? Why does it feel like anything, right? And that's kind of the key problem here, right? The easy problems we just saw, okay, there are neurons in the brain that correlate with the percept, but how come it feels like anything? Right? How come consciousness feels like something? And the problem is that the scientific methods don't allow us to get at that level, right? It's limited to the neural correlate, but they don't get to the question, well, how can these brain processes feel like anything at all? And so there are two responses. One is, you can say, well, we've got to respect science, and we just deny the existence of consciousness. It's kind of an illusion, and that's Stan's statement by Dennett, for instance, that, and so here's a quote from his book, that, well, I'll just read, right? I guess I still get a little bit of time. So what we learn, when we learn that the only difference between gold and silver is the number of subatomic particles in their atoms, you may feel cheated or angry. Those physicists have explained something away. The goldness is gone from gold. They've left out the very silveriness of silver that we appreciate. And when they explain the way reflection absorption, electromagnetic radiation, accounts for colors in the color vision, they seem to neglect the very thing that matters the most. But of course there has to be some leaving out, otherwise they wouldn't have begun to explain. Leaving something out is not a feature of failed explanations, but of successful explanations. So I got this over here in small, but you might have seen the sleight of hand here, right? That it doesn't explain the subjective experience at all, right? It's and it's fine. It's not the focus of physics to explain subjective experiences, but if you talk about consciousness, then we got to get to that, right? And so here, it doesn't explain the subjective experience of goldness. It's actually funny that then it takes color vision as an example, because color vision is known in the community as one thing that you cannot explain just by electromagnetic waves. So here's a little illustration. So here you see two squares, right? They seem different, right? This one seems dark, this one seems light, and whoa, PowerPoint magic, right? They're exactly the same. And so, or here's another example. We have two images. They show the same kind of scene. You see an orange, which is orange. You see grapes that are green. You see an orange that's orange. You see grapes that are green. Yet the wavelength that's reflected from these both is exactly the same, right? And again, so here physics cannot account for what we have in the brain. It's much more complicated. The other alternative is, so then it's basically, someone said very humorously, it's like sort of that cancer doesn't exist, and then say you've cured cancer, right? So the other alternative is going to be Christoph Koch a couple of years ago, and he was from the panpsychic group, right? That says basically everything is conscious. In some way, everything can be conscious, and so your iPhone can be conscious, your thermostat can be conscious, but it again sidesteps the hard problem, right? I mean, how does it feel like anything at all, right? So you're going to say it doesn't exist, or everything's conscious, but it doesn't get to the problem of quality. So now getting back to religion, right? So we have a similar situation here, right? So in conscious research, we try to use science to tackle conscious research, from consciousness, and there's just it just falls short because we cannot account for the subjective experience. And there's a similar challenge in religion, right? Because there's the supernatural, right? The pesky supernatural, if you study religion. Right? There's kind of the creator God. There have been monotheistic religions, and I'm not an expert in Buddhism, but Fran talked about some ideas. Okay, there's this the city of the karma, right? And but in these monotheistic religions, the idea is that God provides an explanation for otherwise extremely unlikely events. Like, okay, there's the universe, right? There's life. Right? Where does it come from? And these religions also posit that this supernatural is still involved in the natural today. Right? So it's not that we can't just push it away and say, well, it was back then. But this idea that there is a supernatural that's involved with the natural. And so I think that when we study religion, might be an interesting question what to do about the supernatural. Should we deny it? Should we affirm it? I mean, I don't think we can just ignore it, right? You have to take a stand. And so, if you deny it as the supernatural, then it makes the study of religion simpler, right? It's just like anything else, like object recognition, for instance, that we're studying. But then the question is, I mean, we as scientists, I mean, what's the evidence to reject it? And I think we kind of ruled out, right? I mean, there's no evidence or no compelling evidence to reject the supernatural. So, now the other alternative is that we leave out the possibility there is the supernatural, but then again, we have to be aware of limitations. Okay, how far can science get us in studying or in telling us what religion is, what spirituality is? So, because by definition, the supernatural is outside of this world. There's a nice quote by C.S. Lewis, who said, look for God or heaven by exploring space. It's like reading or seeing all Shakespeare's plays in the hope that you will find Shakespeare as one of the characters. Right? So I think it's a very exciting time. And so, I mean, I think we have to be aware that empirical studies can only take us so far, right? There's, I mean, by design, we can look at the fingerprints of religion in the brain and how it interacts with the brain. But then there's key aspects there that we just cannot get to by science. Right? On the other hand, we've seen exciting data here in this symposium, right, that raise very provocative questions. So for instance, Deb said, was quoted in another paper, that God is a likely thing for a human mind to construct. And so it's fascinating questions. So I mean, why is that? Right? What's the explanation for this? Is it intelligent design? Is it survival of the fittest? Right? And so I think there's, when we have the data, Jordan and Jonas's data on religious beliefs and religiosity, our principle of hardware. We have Deb's finding this pre-wiring for belief. And designer, we have Fran's observations about the shortcomings of science in tackling questions of religion, especially spirituality. And so I think they all make us ponder deep questions, right? That make religion so interesting. That we hopefully going to get to in the next few minutes when we talk about this question. Okay, so thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the speakers to please come up on stage, and we now have an opportunity to cross-examine.
So if anyone has questions, just come down the aisle here to me or Katie. So. Thank you. It was very interesting. I have two comments. The first is, if I recall correctly, then one of the first neuroimaging studies of religious experience was with Carmelite nuns. They felt one with God while in the scanner, and the result was that the visual cortex, the insula, and the orbital frontal cortex were activated, suggesting that this deeply religious experience was very similar to any other gratifying experience that humans can experience. So in this respect, I totally agree with the neural evidence that there is no center for religion or a God module in the brain. But what I wanted to talk about, and I think to my surprise no one mentioned that, is the fact that when you think about religion from an evolutionary perspective, there was no advantage to create a God or to believe in God, except for one advantage, and this is the social glue that basically increases the chances of a group to survive. And it's interesting, in my opinion, because it's part of the human condition. And when you look at the evidence that we have, then about at the same time, like perhaps 70,000 years ago, humans start creating both religious symbols and art. And for both, you needed ways to communicate and very developed prefrontal cortex. So I guess when we do study the neural basis of religion, we always have to understand the context that basically it's not only an individual experience, but it also in context of a group, of society, and social cognition.
Did any of the speakers have anything to add or anything to that, or should we?
Jordan, welcome back to the area. I have a question for you, because we work together on the TBIs. I did not understand your point. When the subjects have a problem in their structural brain, does it change the connectivity, and as a result they get more spiritual or more mystic? This is your inference?
Yeah, the short answer would be yes, there's a tendency, it's a probability. There are many other factors, right? It's just that you get a lesion and automatically you're going to be like that. So there are other factors, but there's a tendency for that to happen. There's a higher probability for that to be the case in males who fought in Vietnam and had brain injuries.
Yeah, then why you don't use DTI for that? Diffusion tensor
Because I
imaging
will
to
tell
see.
you, can I tell you why?
Yeah, sure.
Because you don't have to have a long story here, because they have retained metal and we cannot do MRI. So these are CT scans.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're going to have that mic up there, so you guys can talk into a mic too.
Hi, I'm Adam Green, and actually probably have at least one question for each of you, but I'll let Pat take the mic other places and maybe bring it back if there's time. Going sort of leftish to right, Max, can I challenge you on the Dan Dennett thing? Because I think everything you said really coheres nicely. I just wonder if either Dan Dennett meant something differently, or we could take something different from what you excerpted. So maybe the best meaning of that statement is that there might be sort of analogous explanation to the difference between silverness and goldness that could account for the difference between the subjective experience that is religious and that is not, and that maybe you can take that, maybe the fact that explaining gold itself isn't explaining the subjective experience of gold doesn't have to limit how we think about the scientific approach to the subjective experience of religion, and that maybe we're not really looking for Shakespeare, we're looking for what it feels like to read Shakespeare, and if we found that, right, maybe that's, at least as far as neuroscience really cares to go in the study of religion. I don't know if that makes sense.
No.
Well, I could, oh, here we go. Okay, great. Takes a while for us to travel. No, I think it's a very good point. I mean, it's not saying that cognitive neuroscience doesn't have anything to tell us about religion, right? I mean, obviously we see it has a lot to tell us, right? But then the question is, okay, I mean, religion is more than just beliefs, right? The way that consciousness is more just than neural activity, and that's the part, right, where we need more, where we just can't get to with science, because it's based on measurements in the natural world, right? Where it's more kind of a philosophical question, if you want, right? That we can't get to, I mean, like David Chalmers actually said about Dan Dennett, maybe he's a zombie, right? Because you can't tell from the outside, right? And that's exactly the problem, right? The same with religion, right? We can try to boil it down to, okay, here are these rules you have to follow, but that's not religious experience, right? And this part of the supernatural, the same way with the qualia, it's just something we have to think about it differently, right? It's not to say, I mean, science is part of it, it's great, just it provides hypotheses, and Deb's data, I think, are very interesting to see, okay, well, how do our minds work, right? But then there's this connection to something else, in this case, the supernatural, that we just have to get at somewhere in some other way, like philosophy, theology. So I pass it on to Jordan.
Get my workout in today.
Hi, I'm Christy D. Simone. Thank you so much. This was really interesting symposium. I read an article prior to coming to this that was speaking about damage to the right parietal lobe of the brain can increase awareness of self, and then as a result increase spirituality. And I'm wondering if, so just to clarify, decrease awareness of self, increase spirituality. And I'm wondering if any of you have insight on that particular finding, and if you've found any further information on that.
I'm not sure I'm familiar with the particular study, but I guess one thing I can say is that self is a complicated, multifaceted phenomenon. So I guess when we talk about the self and the brain in relation to religion, we have to think about what exactly we're talking about. So there are the aspect of self that has to do with the representation of our physical body in space. And certainly diminishing those feelings can give us experiences that feel like out-of-body experiences and might be interpreted by people as religious experiences. Then there are also aspects of our self that persist in time and have to do with our self-narrative and our story of who we are. And those are actually the things that I'm more interested in how our beliefs get incorporated into our identity, and how the brain, once a belief is part of our identity, that the brain may have an interest in protecting it just like it protects the body. So I guess that's some thoughts to your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks for a great discussion this morning. So I kind of have a two-parter question. Both the questions kind of revolving around the development of the prefrontal cortex. So I'm really curious about the age that the teleological explanation is suppressed, around 10 or 11, and that, in my mind, is conspicuously dovetailing with the development of the prefrontal cortex in early adolescence. And we saw that when we damage the prefrontal cortex in veterans, that you get or it's related to an increase in report of mysticism or spirituality, I guess. So I'm wondering if the kids, if you went a little bit further than 10 or 11, 12, if you could see a relationship between suppression of the teleological explanation and maybe their inhibitory control, or I saw you had Stroop tested in one of the studies, but I didn't see the data for it. So I'm curious about that.
So there is a correlation. We found it once, we didn't replicate it. A correlation between people who have increased inhibitory control and lower teleological tendency. Okay, but I don't want to interrupt your question. Have you finished?
Well, the other part was, I'm wondering if it was more. I'm wondering if the PFC is more related to whether or not the agent that can be identified is is it like a monotheistic religion or not? Because I'm thinking about Buddhism and how Fran mentioned that the purpose of the meditation or meditating on the beliefs is to basically evoke self-restraint. And contain your actions and thoughts and speech. Whereas those actions or those things inherently involve prefrontal cortex involvement, where if you damage the PFC in adulthood, then you get a more mysticism or more spirituality. I might be conflating a couple of things. I don't know if the adults in the veteran study were, if they claim themselves to be monotheistic or not, but that's another part. That's the other part of the question.
So let me speak to have we ever followed people out in terms of theological bias? We did a study in Romania looking at adults. So it's very hard for us to come across adults who have low levels of scientific explanation. So the explanation I've given you in the talk is the reason why we're seeing suppression is because children have increased scientific understanding and they understand the cultural norms, which is to start to generate physical causal explanations for things, even though the teleological tendency might still be there. They know what the right answer is that they should be stating. So we went to look at a population of individuals who were adults who you can't find, it's not easy to find people who are not being educated in Western populations. So we went to Romania and we were studying Romanian Romani adults who the form of education that they were receiving was not scientific education. We looked to see whether or not in those individuals do we actually see the teleological bias drop off in adults, and we don't. And actually found a correlation with the amount of scientific education that they'd had and the degree to which their teleological bias dropped off. So it seems to be associated with knowledge acquisition. Suppressing, and and also inhibitory control, because you know the right thing to say. You've got to inhibit your bias.
Thank you. This is probably a question for Max, but I'll be interested in an opinion of all the speakers. Dr. Riesenhuber, you mentioned there is so far there is no evidence to deny the existence of supernatural, and from your talk, I guess you're arguing that in principle there couldn't even be an evidence because it's supernatural, and in science we study natural phenomena. What would be your answer to people who propose the argument that, based on the principle that, if you don't have to posit existence of something, then don't do it, right? So the simplest explanation is the best one. So yes, we couldn't deny it, but if there's no evidence to propose supernatural, there's no reason to bring it in. Is the evidence for that just the subjective experience of religion, in your opinion, or something else?
No, I think it's great. So, scientific evidence isn't the only evidence there can be, right? You probably believe that George Washington was our first president, right, without having made an experiment to test that, right? So there are forensic evidence, right? We sentence people to death based on evidence that's based on eyewitnesses and things like that. So to say there's no supernatural, right, we have to have looked everywhere, right? And so just logically, we cannot rule it out, right? It's like, we know how big the universe is, and it's a very simple argument. There are others that, the question is then, if you say there's no supernatural, then how do you account for other facts, right? And that's like, just the existence of the universe that's so low entropy, right? The fact, the fine-tuning, the existence of life, right? There are all these observations that, like, if you look at the probabilities without involving the supernatural, right? It's like 10 to the minus and then hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, right? And so I just don't have enough faith to reject the supernatural and say, okay, well, I'm just going to believe in that because then I could, it's equally likely a fairies appear all of a sudden, right? So I think it's a question, given all these very unlikely events, right? Then what's the best explanation for this? Right? And so I think that's an argument for the supernatural, but I think just on the basis of if you say something does not exist, you have to rule out everything. And that's just, it's just at this very basic logical level, you cannot rule it out.
So here's one religious response to that question. So it's stated in the early Buddhist texts that the Buddha said that these sorts of questions about the nature of the world, the supernatural questions, the metaphysical questions. He literally responded, in that way, madness lies. Okay, so this is itself a religious answer. Okay, so what's also interesting is, of course, Buddhism is filled with supernatural stories, narratives, assertions such as that of karma and rebirth. So I think perhaps one way of bridging this divide that Max is pointing to is to ask the question, what do beliefs in the supernatural, if we're going to define religious beliefs as beliefs in the supernatural, what do they do for the brain? This is the interesting question. And I think we, have a tendency to top, bottom up in terms of, how the brain produces religious beliefs or what are the neural correlates of religious beliefs. But the question could also be, what do religious beliefs do to the brain, which results in religious ends, so that the scientific investigation doesn't have to be a reductive one, which I think neuroscience in regard to religion is often accused of doing, reducing religion to brain states. But if you talk about what religious beliefs do to the brain that is expressed as experiences and actions on the ground, then that is a way of taking religious experiences seriously.
We do have some evidence. We know, for example, that meditation and yoga increase the volume of gray matter in some regions of the brain. But what does it mean?
With the reference by the woman over there about suggesting that religious beliefs seem to develop, were you suggesting prefrontal cortex activity or engage it by restraining behavior? That's another interesting observation. I think most people think of spirituality as something like mystical experience of the divine, but I think it could be as straightforward as cultivating this ability to restrain one's moral behavior or social behavior that leads, again, to concrete religious ends.
Hi, Jack. Hi, Jordan. It's good to see you. I think this work, the work that you and Aaron and others have done is just really cool, and I'm intrigued about the oxytocin, the OXTR stuff that you're doing, and just if you have any thoughts on the relationship to kind of the broader cognitive neurogenetic picture on oxytocin and things like coping with stress, depression, things like, nasal oxytocin relating to social affiliation. And we know, we think we know that the religious belief may have some prophylactic effects against depression and feelings of isolation. And if maybe you could just kind of tie in those ideas, and maybe that's what you're up to in studying oxytocin in the first place. And even one other thought, and then I'll let you talk. What would you think about sort of nasal oxytocin and effects sort of as an experimental manipulation on kind of strength of belief or sort of relation to God?
Yeah, I'm very interested in the use of oxytocin in strengthening belief that you can recover from a brain injury, and therefore you participate more actively in your therapy. That's not religious necessarily, but it's another use of belief, a kind of belief.
Faith.
So that's something that we would like to do. Now we only, we had a total of 500 plus veterans with brain injuries, and we only have genetics on about 199 of them. And of that, we only have a panel that extends to about 120 genes. So we can, we have to work within those constraints, and they're very small numbers. Every time we try to publish something, we have to fight with statisticians and geneticists that we had a priori hypotheses that you can do this, and somebody can test and see if it's valid or not, right? I hope we're not wasting journal space with this kind of argument. So, yes, I think that not just oxytocin, but vasopressin and men and women, seeing if it has the same, all that stuff I think is useful if you're interested in building blocks that pertain to why you develop religious beliefs as part of a social fabric that you belong to. And I think we've heard comments and we've seen data here that suggests religious belief is an organizing principle for social systems. It's and in some sense we've heard that there's ultimate punishment here. It's just not your parent throwing you out of the house, but it could be eternal hell. I mean, there is, depending on your religious belief. So it is a really impressive factor if you're looking to constrain behaviors, right? I mean, and I think you can investigate certain kinds of supernatural belief. I mean, I showed that photograph of that cloud, right? And I think if you went back pre-science days, somebody would interpret that as a supernatural phenomenon, that it's God reaching out to me and that I do something wrong, it was a threat. That is supernatural in one definition. It's just not a supernatural figure. Although you can interpret just the hand of God. And so I think we can study and test those things now. We have science. What we haven't seen are some of the incredible stories that you find in the testaments, the testimonies. Right? That's hard to see nowadays. And when certain religions have ways of sort of supporting the idea of miracles, for example, miraculous things that can't be explained through science, often scientists are not allowed to have their say in those arguments, right? You know, it's a matter of probability or coincidence. You can't go in there and say, well, the chances of this happening do exist. But they're very low, but they do exist. And if you search enough times, you're going to find some story like that that can explain that phenomenon. So, and it's hard, by the way, to study that in labs because you have to recruit all these people to participate. And I might add, in our studies, you could also argue in our studies, we just took people, in essence, who wanted to get paid for doing their experiments. One way to study this, of course, is to study experts, right? To study priests, to study rabbis, to study whomever happens to represent the most knowledgeable and the most, like the nuns, right, like the study of nuns. That would be the way, another way to study this. So if you're interested in reasoning, you can study the average person, or you can study experts, chess, or these days, computational devices, which seem to be something we'll have to consider in the future. What will robots autonomously come up with if they become autonomous agents and are no longer directly controlled by us? So that would be actually an interesting way. Can computational models develop religious belief or supernatural belief or not? Because these are going to be incorporated into these kinds of agents who will be a part of our lives. That's a different story, not the topic of this symposium. Did I actually ever answer your question?
You know, I'm interested in the oxytocin stuff. We can talk more about that at any time. I don't want to.
Yeah, so just to get back and finish and conclude on your, so oxytocin is one of many genes that make up that are important for social behavior, whether it be genes concerned with reward, social affiliations, etc. And therefore, you're born with these, and you can have variants, and like I showed, and like throughout the literature. So if you have one variation, you may probability. This is all probability. It's Bayesian. You may have a probability of behaving in a certain way under certain circumstances. So genes are important, and psychologists get trained in accounting for variance. That's our training. That's what we're supposed to do. So if you can identify another factor that accounts for some variation in behavior, like a gene, and you have enough numbers, take advantage of it. And like you said, potentially it's manipulative, right? Aren't they putting oxytocin in perfumes? So I think you can, there are various ways to use this, and of course even in the literature that shows it induces affiliation, there's counter evidence. And it may only be for in-groups, not for out-groups, right? And that may hold true for religion and religious priming as well. And so I did get back to that.
I think we're getting pretty close to time.
We'll just stop there because we're scheduled to finish at 12, and we do have some people with very limited time who want to leave, and I know Dad has to go to the airport. What I'm going to do is
There was supposed to be lunch outside, but we rescheduled, and those who can, please come with us to the faculty club for lunch there. Okay? So maybe one last question, and then we leave the faculty.
Back to the Dan Dennett point about silver and gold. There's more than one science. There's physics, and they would define these things in the way that you indicated. But there's also chemistry that would define these things quite differently. So you can operate at the level of particles, as the physicists do, or at the level of elements in the way that chemists do. It's not to say that chemistry is invalid or physics is the real science. There's also cognitive science. And cognitive science would define silver and gold very differently. And so the question is, are there significant generalizations and idealizations that can be created at some level? In which case you've got a successful science. So hopefully that's what we're seeing with cognitive science at this point of development. But then let's go back to the evolution questions. What happened 70,000 years ago? Well, something that seems to have happened approximately 70,000 years ago is that the language capacity evolved in the species. That's the favorite date of most people. The language capacity and therefore thought, right? That's on the assumption that language and thought are at least very closely related, perhaps even identical. That doesn't mean that religious belief evolved at that time. What language and thought gives you as a framework for expressing, in the case of language, sentences, or in the case of thought, particular thoughts. To ask whether or not there's going to be a science of religion is like asking, are there significant generalizations that can be stated at some particular level independently of the levels of language and thought, given that those are the faculties that evolve. And I'm just not sure, and having heard the talks this morning, whether or not there are prospects of a science of religion or a science of spirituality, not clear.
So what's their question? Sorry, I didn't realize. So the question is whether it can be a science of religion. Well, I think, as we've seen, you can do very, very good science studying religion. But the question is, what aspect of religion do you want to describe? And religion obviously has beliefs, right? And it has, we can look at cognitive biases and questions like that that are very developmental questions. But then religion is also a lot more, right? And it's and especially this aspect of the supernatural, right? It's just religion religion has people. So it doesn't come down to just a set of rules and you do that and that's fine, right? But like for instance, Jonas was talking about in the beginning with these sacred values, right? And so there are. Then, we all have certain beliefs, right? It's not like, no one's a materialist, right? You still have a belief that, okay, I'm going to do science based on, or I'm going to only believe scientific statements, but obviously that's not a scientific statement. So, we all have beliefs that we can't justify, that we just adopt. And so then the question is, okay, well, what are they going to believe? Because as pointed out, it has eternal significance. And so those are aspects, then I think that, are separate from the study of religion as a cognitive phenomenon, right? And that I think are important for us to consider, not just doing good science, but in terms of thinking about, okay, well, what does this all point to? Again, I think there are very valid science that can be done, but it's just not all there is to religion, but it actually points to something that's a lot bigger than that.
On that point, I think we'll finish, and thank you very much.